Um, I had a tough time deciding on a title for this talk. Las Islas Encantadas showed up on one of my Wikipedia searches. The Enchanted Islands is the translation of that. But I had heard another phrase referring to tortoises as a result of reading some material in the book called The Brief History of Time, which is, of course, a Stephen Hawking publication. And in the very first chapter, Hawking describes a situation where Bertrand Russell was speaking to a group, and he described how the Earth orbits around the Earth and how the sun, in turn, orbits around the center of a vast collection of stars called our galaxy. At the end of the lecture, a little old lady at the back of the room got up and said, "What you have told us is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant tortoise," as in the sketch there. The scientist, of course, gave a self-satisfied smug to himself and said, "Well, what is the tortoise standing on?" "You're very clever, young man," she said. It's tortoices all the way down." Now, she actually said turtles. But I went looking for the difference between these and came across a number of graphics that showed turtles all the way down. And as I looked at these, I realized, well, look, some of those have got columnar feet with claws on the end, and others have flippers. And the one on the far right, I don't know, the artist kind of took liberties, and he's got a web-shaped clawed foot. Just what is it? Are the Galapagos turtles tortoises, or are they turtles? Well, the answer is yes. All tortoises are in fact turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. I don't know whether this is just an intellectual neuroticism on the part of some scientists who said, "Oh well, yeah, let's create some kind of a fancy phrase that we can use to stump people." All tortoises are in fact turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. Well, here's the breakdown. As I discovered, I didn't know this. And by the way, full disclosure, this is a physics teacher standing in front of you, trying to talk biology to a room full of biologists. I mean, how more trepidatious, isn't that a nice word, can one be to attempt something like that? But I had such a great opportunity to visit the Galapagos that I wanted to share it with you. So here's a bit of a travel log, but there's going to be some science thrown in. I'm sure most of you already know that the larger classification of tortoises and turtles is turtle. And that's a little confusing, but tortoises are the land-dwelling versions, and the turtles are the ones that you normally find in the oceans. They have different habitats. They have different dietary requirements. One is herbivorous, the other one is omnivorous, but both of them lay eggs on land. And in the Galapagos, you will find not only the land turtles, the tortoises, in fact, laying eggs on the beaches, but also the sea turtles laying eggs on the beaches. So there's that commonality between those two groups. Okay, well, I've noticed right away that there's really two large sort of differences between the tortoises on the Galapagos, and I apologize if I call them turtles, okay? Technically, they are turtles. But tortoises came generally in two varieties, and we saw them in various locations. There's the saddlebacks, which is pictured on the left, and the domeback, which is pictured on the right. Now, it is true that this is not a species-specific thing. There are several species of saddlebacks and several of domebacks distributed throughout the island. But one of the neat things is that virtually every island is its own species, to the extent that the folks that live in the area can literally tell what island a tortoise came from just by its physical characteristics. You know, we're talking species here. The phrase origin of species is going to come to us at some point later on when we talk Charles Darwin. But these are not species. These are just variations, characteristics that I immediately noticed, and that is a good way of sort of distinguishing between what you have on the Galapagos. In the ocean waters around the Galapagos, there are these guys with the flippers, which are the green sea turtles. When Darwin first investigated the area in 1835, I believe it was, he created this map. And this particular drawing is found in chapter 17 of his book, The Voyage of the Beagle. And there's only 29 pages in that chapter. It's headed Galapagos, and there's a brief summary of what he saw there, and then the detailed description of his 22 days that he was on the shores of the Galapagos Islands. He stayed in the area, or they stayed in the area for about a month and a half, but only 22 days, 3 weeks approximately on land. It's a testament to the fact that he did so much searching and collecting and cataloging and categorizing and discussing with the inhabitants about those creatures on the island. When you look at the volume of work that he produced, especially in connection to the finches, and the fact that that they play such an important role in the formation of his theory of evolution, is a testament to the man's genius. He was indeed a genius in that regard, an epitome of observer, and a great talent in terms of recording information. He kept journals while he was on land, but then came back and transcribed those into a larger journal on the ship. And that is available, in fact, in the book that is now reprinted for the 62nd time. I have a copy here you can look at, plus half a dozen copies of chapter 17. It only took me a few minutes to copy all of the information about the Galapagos that he wrote. It's a very interesting read. I highly recommend it. Anyway, you'll recognize the names of some of these islands, the Chatham Island and Albemarle. They're local sort of names. The one that always twists my tongue is the one in the middle there. Well, how do you say that? Indefatigable Islands. That's a much simpler island now. It's called Santa Cruz. When the Ecuadorians annexed the islands, they changed the names of these to something a little bit more familiar to us, as we'll see. They're the more modern names of those: Santa Cruz, Isabella, San Cristobal, Santiago, are the four main islands, the four largest islands of that particular group. To give you an idea of just the land area involved, if we took Bruce County, north of Owen Sound, up to the tip of the Bruce, Tobermory, you'd have approximately the vertical stretch of the big island, Isabella, and they'd fit quite nicely in the bay out there. Also, coincidentally, if you take the population of Owen Sound, Port Elgin, and Tobermory, you have about the population of the Galapagos Islands as well, about 30 to 35,000 people. There's not a lot of folks living there, but what an amazing environment it is. The wildlife is just spectacular. The uniqueness of it, and I labeled or indicated these in the yellow color: the giant tortoise found nowhere else, land and marine iguanas found nowhere else, the marine iguana found nowhere else on the planet. Sea lions and fur seals, again, specific species that are indigenous to the Galapagos. Lava lizards, the penguin, and an interesting snake that eats fish. How many of our local snakes do that? I don't know of any. That one certainly is unique. In the oceans around the waters are more generally found animals that you find in oceans all over the world: sharks and turtles and dolphins. In the air, albatrosses, of course. The Galapagos hawk is found only in that area. Some species of finches, mockingbirds, tanagers, similarly found only in the Galapagos. Cormorants are flightless in the Galapagos. Their wings have shrunk to the point, well, I guess they just don't need them because they're fish eaters. They dive into the ocean, into the waters, and capture fish that way. There's red and blue-footed boobies, and I'll talk more about those later. There are frigate birds as well. And insects, probably the most unique one is a solitary insect like our bumblebee, the carpenter bee. There are no other species of bees on the Galapagos. So its job of pollination is important in that particular area, but other insects, of course, do that as well. Now, on the downside, we have a lot of invasive species as well. And right off the bat, the goats are particularly obnoxious. They virtually eat all of the undergrowth and the foodstuffs that are typically the foodstuffs of the tortoises and other animals like that. And they get into an area, become feral, and they literally devastate the entire habitat. So once goats got involved or transported into the islands, things changed quite dramatically for the species. Nowadays, there are literally hunting parties organized by the government, and they go out and they kill thousands of these goats on various islands. In many cases, the only way they can rejuvenate an island is to get rid of the goats 100%. And that's exactly what they're doing. These are indeed invasive species. The same is true of rats and cats as well. There's an interesting one, the fire ant, which attacks the eggs and the young of the hatchlings of the giant tortoise and can kill them. I don't know how an ant would be interested in hauling back one of these to their food larder, but there it is. And on the plant side, the blackberry bush grows in such thick masses that it prevents any other animals from penetrating through. So once a blackberry bush thicket gets established, it can literally block the pathways, the migration pathways of the tortoises up into the upper parts of islands, where they find water and shelter and food, and then trek back down to the ocean levels, the beaches. So the blackberry and the guava as well are two very invasive plants, perhaps similar, well, definitely similar to our Phragmites problem here. Okay, geologically, the islands are quite unique, and much like the volcanic islands of the Hawaiian chain, we find the Galapagos Islands have some similarities to those. They are at the equator, as indicated. They're relatively young. The Hawaiian Islands are considerably older than these, but these are young and relatively small in extent. The islands are located on the Nazca Plate, and if you're familiar with plate tectonics, to some extent, we have four, if you like, include the continental plate of South America, involved in the geological sort of background for the Galapagos. They are right at the junction point of three ocean rises where volcanic material comes to the surface. Not only that, but they're above a hot spot in the mantle of the Earth at this particular location, exactly like the Hawaiian Islands are. The Nazca Plate with the Galapagos is shuffling off towards South America and diving underneath and creating the mountain chain of the Andes as a result of that geological activity at a rate of 40 to 53 millimeters a year. No speed limits being broken there. The significance of the hotspot, as I mentioned, is that these islands then essentially form over the hotspot, and then as the Nazca Plate carries those formed islands to the east, new islands form on the western side. So the western islands, the islands Isabella and Fernandina, are indeed quite a lot younger geologically than the ones further east, Espanola and San Cristobal. And so when you look at the yellow, our islands marked here in yellow, those are the inhabited ones, and Isabella is one of the younger ones, so is Fernandina, but it's not inhabited. As you can see, the long sort of gradation of these, The total number of islands is somewhere in the range of 127. And this particular graphic with no water shown shows some of the submerged islands too that have been eroded down and are below sea level. So there's more than just the ones above water that we in fact see. The history politically of these is interesting. First discovered by the Bishop of Panama, who got blown off course in a storm in 1535. He reported back that there was these giant tortoises on the islands and lush vegetation, lush wildlife in that form, as well as water available. So it quickly became a haven for pirates and whalers, who took their toll on the tortoises. Tortoises are a ready food source. They're large, meaty, they have reservoirs of water, so you literally can just shuffle a tortoise or two into the hold of the ship and it'll survive quite nicely without any food or attention until you're ready to have turtle soup for supper. So the many hundreds of thousands of tortoises that were present, and they estimate probably 250,000 that were in this area, were very dramatically decreased, numbers dramatically decreased in a fairly short order. And now the number 20,000 is considered to be a reasonable estimation of how many there are left. We're talking about 10% of what was here originally, even just 300 years ago. Ecuador annexed the Galapagos in 1832, and apart from a minor economic activity that was done there because of the tortoises being a relatively valuable food source, they used it as a prison colony. That didn't last for too long, but Darwin was there at the end of that era, 1835. And as I mentioned, stayed around for about 6 weeks, only 22 days actually on land doing his collections and his recording of the activities, dissections of the animals that he found in the process. So a very, very productive 3-week interval on land in the Galapagos. By 1905, we have a couple of hundred settlers, and into the more modern era, 1959, it was recognized by the Ecuadorian government that this is a very, very interesting area that should be preserved for future generations. So a national park was declared in 1959. It didn't get really started with adequate administration and funding until 15 years or so later, 1974. That's the reason for that date. Darwin Research Station was founded about the same time because it was recognized that they needed to know more about the biology of these organisms. And then in 1978, the UNESCO declared this a World Heritage Site. Looking at the volcanoes is quite interesting. The islands to the west, as I mentioned, are quite young. And you might think, well, if you've got volcanic activity in these islands, why would you go there? Isn't it dangerous? Aren't you going to have the islands blowing up? Well, the eruptions are very gentle in this particular situation. The basalt that's emitted in the lava, etc., from these is quite runny. So it just flows out and does not trap gases in it. So there's no explosive eruptions. It's not thick and plug up vents so that then pressure builds up and then an eruption happens. All of that goes on in the Hawaiian Islands, but the Galapagos is fairly safe. It's volcanic, but the inhabitants don't feel themselves threatened by the volcanic activity. Obviously, you're going to have lava flows in places, especially on the younger islands, but it's not a threat to the environment in that regard. 21 or so volcanoes, and 2 years to the day after Rebecca and I left, we were there for only 3 days in February of 2020. And I wish it had been more like 10 days. It would have been a much more interesting and instructive stay. As it is, I found out a lot I didn't know on Wikipedia. So, but as you can see, the islands, Isabella and Fernandina, are essentially volcanoes. And in this 3D rendering, you can see the craters. They're still young enough that they show up in these aerial maps. But notice Santiago and Santa Cruz further east are not as apparently volcanic. There are volcanic structures there, lava flows, etc. But you don't see those craters except in small forms in certain locations. And you might look at this and say, well, okay, this is just fresh volcanic soil. Well, it's not fresh. This is thousands of years old. The ocean has had a chance now to do some erosion. There's some rounded rocks there. There are even some pelicans in the water. And there's the little red blobs there. Those are Sally Lightfoot crabs. And they're scurrying around everywhere. It does not take much soil in order for cactus to start growing. There is a species of cactus in the Galapagos called the lava cactus. And virtually, by a week or two after the temperature drops and some soil has started to develop and erosion has taken its toll, these cactus start growing. Seeds get blown in by the wind or carried in by wildlife, and you start to get the plants taking over. It's a wonderful example of how nature recirculates or recharges, these sorts of areas, landforms, which at first sight look completely and totally barren and inimical to life. And then, you come back a decade later and there's plants growing everywhere. This is typical of the Galapagos, to the extent that there's prickly pear cactus growing on some of the islands. And it is, in fact, a favorite food source of some of the larger turtles, especially the ones with the saddlebacks, with the ability to raise their necks through that notch to the higher levels than the domebacks would. They actually feed on these type of cactus. So here we go. That's a volcano in the background. That is an example of a shield volcano. It is not typical of the ones in Hawaii. Those tend to be more cone-shaped. And any cones in the Galapagos are relatively small. And they're fairly quickly eroded by wind and ocean activity. And you can see the beaches form here. I'm always amazed at how black lava can produce white beaches. But I'm told, Wikipedia again, that the basaltic lava in the Galapagos, when it breaks down, it forms whitish crystals, whitish particles. And I immediately remember in geology class many years ago, and Steve Dickey will bear this out, you take a mineral, you rub it on a piece of porcelain, unglazed porcelain, and you get usually a light colored powder, even from something that's a dark mineral to begin with. So the fine pulverized materials of lava, which starts out looking quite black, can in fact end up being quite light in color. Not always. There are some iron particles that give you a kind of a brownish coating to the beach, as in this particular case here. But you can see life is rejuvenating. It's coming back on these what were originally just barren lava cones and volcanic eruptions. And that's in one particular case at the Galapagos, and I didn't have the opportunity to go here, but there is olivine in the lava, in the lava flows from one of the volcanoes. And the olivine crystals are very resistant to erosion, and they actually break out of the matrix and form greenish sand. So there is a beach with green sand in the Galapagos, along with the white beach that you can see in the background and some of the reddish colored beaches in the foreground. Rainfall is not particularly great in the Galapagos. And, when you compare to Owen Sound, what's the typical rainfall in Owen Sound, folks? Over a year period, most we've had is about 1,100 millimeters, about 3 times as much, excuse me, as you get in the Galapagos. You might think that this type of vegetation would just not survive. It does. There are water sources from springs in the rocks themselves. The turtles actually have identified, located those. And if you go into some of the upper islands, you can see the trails that tortoises make as they migrate from shore to highlands to fill up on water and then take a walk back down. 3 months later, they go back again. So part of the evolutionary pressure in these islands is based on that particular geological fact that water is found in the inner parts of the islands, and you have to travel there. So you have to conserve water as you go, and conserve it for long periods of time as you go about your normal activities. So, I mean, Darwin, I think, recognized something like that. He did mention a few things in that regard with respect to his observations of these tortoises. But it's clear the reason why these tortoises are able to survive to the extent that they do is because of their adaptations to the environment in that regard. It turns out their bladder is actually a very good water storage chamber, and some of the poachers actually use water in the bladder as a drinking source. I can hardly imagine that, but there it is. So it's a jungle out there, and the prevailing winds bring in moisture and fog from the oceans up into the upper regions of the islands, and you do get a very lush foliage and even, as I mentioned, cactus growing. Turtles do indeed find these pools. This is not, in fact, one of those, but it is on a ranch, a private ranch, a turtle ranch that we visited on our trip down to our first overnight. And this particular owner realized that his property was right on a migration path between the ocean and the inlands, the higher elevations of a variety of these domeback turtles, and then left agriculture and went into turtle ranching, so to speak, providing a safe area for the turtles to reside, as well as a place for tourists to come and observe these in large numbers in the inlands. This is virtually in the center of the island Santa Cruz. I'll be pointing out these various graphics here too. This is what I referred to earlier as a domeback, and there's my wife Rebecca taking a picture of one of those. These are monsters as far as tortoises are concerned. They run up into the 800, 900 pound category. The shells, if you go sort of around, can be 1.5 meters or longer. And it takes 6 men, or it did in the early days when these were captured and took on ship, to even just turn one of these over. So they're massive animals. They don't move very quickly, and that's unfortunately part of the problem. They tend to be easy to capture by the predators in the Galapagos, which are non-existent in terms of the sort of food chains that we normally think of. These are the only creatures of this size on the island, apart from some ocean organisms like sea lions or whatever that come in. And it's only humans essentially that preyed on these and reduced the populations to the extent that they did. So there he is. I mean, a face only a mother could love, as they say. And elsewhere on the island, actually at one of the breeding stations on Santa Cruz, we came across the other variety of the saddleback. And here he is. So that little graphic there in white is important in this diagram. It shows where these are distributed. These are all individual species of Galapagos tortoises, and they're broken down into those two varieties, the saddlebacks versus the domebacks. And you'll notice that for the most part, apart from Fernandina, Caledonius fantasticus on Fernandina is the only example of a saddleback over on the western, the right side of this diagram. New islands tend to have low vegetation, so domebacks are the species that tend to thrive there. If you get into the older islands further over to the east, you start to see more of the saddlebacks because the vegetation is now taller and the saddlebacks have adapted to reach that. I might point out Caledonius abingdoni. Lonesome George. You may have heard of this particular creature, touted as being the rarest animal on Earth, the only one of its species. And in fact, he's gone now, so there is no Lonesome George with us anymore. 2012 was when he died. But this, the aging of the turtles, or that particular tortoise, indicated he was well over 100 years old. They did try to mate him with other species that had similar characteristics from other islands. None of the eggs were fertile, and so Lonesome George died quite lonesome in that regard. There he is, and again, a face only a mother could love, I suppose. But what female tortoise would not be attracted to a creature like this? I don't know. You don't have to memorize this. There is no test involved. I just wanted to point out that what at one time was thought to be a single species on Santa Cruz Island turned out to be two. And it was what's now called the Western Santa Cruz giant tortoise and the Eastern Santa Cruz giant tortoise, and mark those in blue. But I wanted to also point out the scientific name for the number 5 there, Don Faustoi. This is actually a name that was given to that particular species to honor the activities of a specific park ranger that devoted 4.5 decades of his life to taking care of tortoises, and was in fact the primary caregiver of LG, Lonesome George, until he died in 2012. And again, Wikipedia stories, you could spend all night reading the first person accounts of Lonesome George and the day that our friend Fausto discovered that he had passed away. It's a sad story. There is a breeding center on Santa Cruz now, which is in fact named after Fausto Loriena as well. So here's a sort of a breakdown of the numbers. 250,000 or so before sailors and whalers got into the area. By the 1970s, we were down to 15,000 for sure. And there was one estimate that indicated there might have been as few as a little over 3,000 left. A wake-up call, if nothing else, in terms of a species going extinct, and not just a specific species, but virtually all of the tortoises on the islands. Captive rearing started about that time, and the population now is back up to under 30,000, and it's continuing to increase. So there's a good side to that story in the sense that captive rearing has in fact helped out. I mentioned already the activity of goats in depleting the habitat for these. So removing goats is an important factor, as well as the other invasive species like the rats and pigs, etc. Pigs in particular will root out the eggs of the young in the beaches and destroy them or eat them. And in fact, poachers still carry on in the area. You still do get court cases involving poachers being fined for killing tortoises. And in general, as the population grows and as the pressure for tourism increases, it is, there's the habitat destruction is carrying on. We see the same kinds of situations in our own Bruce National Park, where the influx of tourists has strained the facilities there. They're, of course, vulnerable. They're slow. They reach sexual maturity only very, very late in life. And unfortunately, there are no other Galapagos tortoises. They're only found there. So this particular umbrella group, the conservation of the Galapagos Conservation Group, Conservancy, was formed to coordinate the activities of not just the national park, which was a sort of a park organization. It was also, which has been around since 1959, but it also coordinates the activities of the Galapagos Conservancy, which has been around since 1985. So the Incentiva Galapagos is an umbrella group that monitors all of these activities. And that was what was missing earlier on. There were research groups, the Charles Darwin Station. There were some breeding groups, but no individual group that kind of monitored the entire list of things that are going on there that need to be done. So there's where the two breeding centers are located, Santa Cruz, and it's essentially coincident with the Charles Darwin Research Station. They're virtually next door. But a new one in 1995 was also started on the second island there of Isabella. Tortoise hatchlings are, well, cute, I guess. They're small and fragile and susceptible to predators. The Galapagos hawks just love these newborn creatures, but they are protected in breeding grounds, or breeding centers. Eventually, once after they're released, of course, the tortoises can get to be quite large. 300 kilograms is a sizable chunk of, well, to be on the downside, a sizable chunk of meat to have on board your ship if you need to eat some point in the middle of a long sea voyage. So year-old ones, these are a little bit older, being tended, and eventually, when they get to about 4 to 5 years old, they are released. And here's an example of a fairly large release of juvenile tortoises in 2017 on a totally uninhabited island on which the native population of tortoises had in fact been reduced to the point where they're essentially going extinct. So those activities are helping. To get away from the tortoises a little bit, of course, the Galapagos is famous for Darwin's finches, and this is the frontispiece of his book, The Voyage of the Beagle, that shows the variations in the beaks of the finches that he studied. And they're everywhere. Another remarkable thing of the Galapagos is that the animals are quite friendly. I mean, you can literally tickle these guys under the chin. This one decided he was going to enjoy some of my wife's pasta, and invited his friend as well. And there they go. And they hopped around on the table beside us for several hours while we had our supper. And even sat in my hat. And one point I looked at this and I said, well, should I let him carry on? I mean, you know what birds do when they kind of sit around for any length of time. But these are polite Galapagos creatures too. They don't poop in your hat. They are indeed everywhere. There's a couple of really cuties there. I was taking these pictures with my cell phone. So, I mean, you don't have to have a large telephoto lens to photograph these. And they come in a variety of different colors, and as well as other species, the mockingbirds. I did not go out intentionally looking for birds. I'm not a birder per se, but they were everywhere. So I just photographed them whenever I could. As far as other animals are other birds are concerned, these are not my photos. I did not get any photos of the blue-footed boobies, but apparently this is a sexual characteristic of the males. These are both males on the left, and they do a dance when they are trying to entice the female. And apparently the bluer the feet and the higher stepping the booby, the greater the attraction. Go figure. I don't know. I'm not a bird, so I don't understand that. I did get some photos of boobies. Sorry, of an apron that had I could not convince my wife to buy this. She said she would never wear this at home, but I said I will. And I've got my Galapagos generic shirt on with sharks and tortoises on it, but I would have loved to have one of those. And pelicans everywhere as well. And some interesting young birds. This was just by fluke a pair of juvenile, I think, yellow-crowned night herons. I'm not sure, but I just love the expression on this guy's face here. He's just he's got that hair that points up. Anyway, and regular herons, the lava heron, we observed, and then this guy, which I'm sure you all have seen locally, but this is not a great blue heron that has migrated to the Galapagos. This is an endemic subspecies of the great blue heron that is native to that particular area. And boy, I couldn't tell the difference between this one and one of our own by any stretch, but there he was out in the water just doing his job, fishing. Lava lizards everywhere, of various sizes. and iguanas. This one here has a scientific name, cristatus, which refers to the white crusty material on this head. This is a land iguana. This also from Darwin's book is a land iguana. Amblyrhynchus. Amblyrhynchus refers to the truncated snout on these creatures. I believe when you talk about RHYN, that's sort of the prefix for the nose. This is a marine iguana, which is recognizable by its flattened tail, which allows it to propel itself through the ocean really well. These are land iguanas again, literally everywhere. You could sit down and then next thing you know, half a dozen iguanas come by, or they're near the water and up on the beach benches, and just incredibly easy to photograph and not at all afraid of humans. Back on the mainland, on return to North America, we stopped in Ecuador. Guayaquil is the main hub for trips, or for plane trips back to the North American continent. And outside of our hotel was this iguana park. These are green iguanas. And I'm just wondering how many of you know what the correct term is for a bunch of iguanas. Like we have flocks of birds, right? But a mess of iguanas. And yeah, they were having a great time trying to keep the pigeons from eating their food. And one interesting little crab that kind of caught my eye because of the color, just amazing. I suspect this was a male in full sexual flamboyant regatta, trying to attract a female, because there were others that looked exactly like this, a bit smaller, that were green and were very much like the background, were indeed more camouflaged than this guy was. In any case, I can see a hawk swooping down and picking this guy off the rocks pretty easily because they just stand out. But I believe, and I'm speculating here, that this is a fairly short interval phase of this coloration to allow for mating, and then they go back to being a little more hidden. Life in Galapagos is laid back. If you want to go for a vacation and relax, there's no other better place to go. This is a sea lion. He waddled up to a bar, didn't even bother to ask for a drink, and then just took a sleep underneath. And after I had my couple of beers, I similarly decided to have a sleep. So like I say, the life in the Galapagos is extremely relaxing. If you're looking for something that's interesting as well as a relaxing vacation, you're certainly welcome there. And it's not just turtles that are big in the Galapagos. You can get a pretty sizable chunk of beer here. This is a blonde ale. It's actually a local brewery, and it was quite tasty, and I enjoyed it. These last two photos are out of sequence. I had this first, and then I did the sleep on the bench. Thank you so much. I'm open for questions. And since we're on Zoom, I'll repeat the question if you have one. Yeah, yes, John. John Dixon mentioned that a book called The Researches of Darwin, Journal of Researches of Darwin, is available. And of course, that's a complementary volume to the Origin of Species, which is his master thesis. But The Voyage of the Beagle, which is the one I referred to, is also a book that you should read. I thoroughly enjoyed. Even the 29 pages in chapter 17 on the Galapagos is incredible. John's comment was that Darwin was a meticulous recorder of the wildlife, as well as the and in word and in pencil drawings, so that we have and all of those materials are still available. So we have a very rich resource of Darwin's thoughts behind that massive scientific thesis of his, The Origin of Species. Yes. Yeah, Darwin Project is a website. The comment here made that there are lots of materials, especially on the internet. The Darwin Project website does have a lot of his, if not most of his materials available for general use. I just might mention the Voyage of the Beagle book that I have here is the 62nd printing. Did I say that already? It's an amazing document. Willie. Yeah, the comment here about, or question about where did the tortoises in fact come from originally. I mean, the islands are volcanic. They're brand new. 5 million years ago, there was no life on them whatsoever. So where did they come from? Well, the current theory is that they were wafted via currents from the mainland. So, and then the natural selection on the islands changed their characteristics. The interesting thing that Darwin found out, it was in the book, is that turtles float. They're quite buoyant. And the ones with the long necks can keep their heads above water and float for literally hundreds of kilometers. The distance now between the mainland of South America and the Galapagos is about 1,000 kilometers. And that would be quite a trip for a tortoise to undertake. But wind currents, water currents, the Humboldt current comes along South America and crosses over into the Galapagos. One of the reasons why the Galapagos is such a rich environment in terms of the animal life there is because it has a very rich ocean nutrient environment. So there are food sources there for them, the Humboldt current in particular. And that's one of about 3 that sort of converge on the islands that brings nutrients to the waters offshore. So once you've got that food, that food chain base built up, then I mean, nature just takes over, and you start to see all of the proliferation of a variety of different organisms. But yeah, that's quite a trip for a pregnant tortoise sort of float from the mainland and end up on an island somewhere, luckily, by luck. But nature works in miraculous ways. They were called the Enchanted Islands for a reason. Brian? I'm sorry, say that again. Vultures? Poachers? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'll look it up and get back to you. Travel between the islands is restricted by the fact that this is a national park. You require a guide to go with you on tours with boats, etc., or on land. That's not a hard and fast rule, but in general, the Galapagos National Park folks require that there be an authorized guide on all of the cruise ships that go around. So although there are opportunities to go there individually on your own and kind of chart your own path, you're going to be restricted by the fact, just like it would be in the national park up north, that it is a facility that is controlled in terms of access to various locations. The issues with the abundance of tourists there are becoming more and more of a problem, because you have to provide them with food, water, etc., accommodation, and there's just limited resources until you start encroaching onto the natural habitats of all of these organisms, which are the reason people come there in the first place. And I'm not telling you anything new, because that's the same issues up in the Bruce Peninsula.
I'd had no idea that the only amount of time that Darwin spent there was 3 weeks. That's stunning, because that's a phenomenal amount of work. John has just spent 3 days, and even that did not disappoint. Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. That's a fabulous presentation, and as a token of our thanks.
Pleasure. Just one last photo to kind of put a downer on all of this. This is a sculpture that was made by one of the local artists, and it's a tortoise with nothing but materials that were found in the oceans, plastic, debris, other material that they found floating around. And I'm sorry that this kind of got put up, but I should explain it, I think. But my apologies.